What's up, you guys? It's Simon. Welcome back to my channel. So I am going to start out this video a little bit controversially, and spoiler alert, I am going to be letting y'all know my opinion on this sketchbook, which is the Crescent Rendr No Show Through Sketchbook, right away. And that opinion is that I do not like this sketchbook. I'm gonna be very honest with y'all. I'm really disappointed. Like, this sketchbook has such a high reputation, and I genuinely don't understand the hype. This sketchbook was so streaky. The colors were like desaturated and honestly such a hot mess. Blending was honestly a nightmare, and I could go on and on about how I feel about this sketchbook currently. I am going to continue to use it for the time being, just to see how I can sort of like switch up my technique, maybe look into how other people have used this sketchbook themselves. Because of course I am fully of the belief that I could be doing something wrong. This type of paper is very new to me. I would compare it to Bristol board. It's just not something I'm familiar with using, or I know how to, I guess you could say, use properly. I don't know if there's like a trick to it to make it look nice. I know Bristol board and similar type materials are a very popular medium for alcohol markers, but as for now, these are just my first impressions of this sketchbook. So my immediate first impression was that I honestly did like the texture of the paper before I started actually drawing on it. It felt really smooth, and it had the tiniest bit of tooth to it. It wasn't like a full sheen like Bristol board, for example, but it also didn't have as much tooth as your average mixed media paper would either. I would say it felt almost like a hybrid between the two, which for a bit had me pretty excited. Of course, like I said before, Bristol board has never worked for me because it just tends to be very streaky, and I would say it's almost like the marker is sitting on top of the page rather than soaking into it, which makes for some very atrocious blending. And like, again, the streaks and like the marks, you can see every little place that you put the marker down on the paper, which is not my vibe. But on the other hand, with mixed media paper, while it does get the sort of like color and blending that I'm looking for, I also know that it eats up the ink of my markers and even tends to wear down the nib the slightest bit. And if you know anything about alcohol markers, you'll know they cost a pretty penny. And while refills and replacement nibs and things like that can make things a little bit cheaper, even then, I don't personally like to have to refill my markers very frequently, because you still gotta pay for the refills. So I really was hoping that it would be sort of like a nice in-between, to the point where, you know, it had enough like slickness that it wouldn't like totally soak up all of my ink, but also enough tooth that it would not, you know, just slide around the paper. But it ended up almost being exactly like Bristol board, which I will get more into when I talk about the actual coloring process later. So something else that I noticed was that despite it feeling kind of lightweight, it must be really thick, because as you'll know, I've been a little bit out of practice with traditional art as of recent, and have been opting to either do line art digitally and print that out onto my paper, or do line art digitally and use a light box to transfer the sketch over. But even with the highest setting on my light box, I literally was not able to get light to penetrate through this page. Like, I literally saw not a single line. It was practically like I was looking at a blank page and sticking a large piece of cardboard underneath it and expecting that to work somehow. Nothing got through, nothing showed through. I don't know if that has anything to do with their no show through technology, but they're right. It did not show through. So instead, what I did was I opted for that trick where you flip your image and then sort of like color the back of the paper with like lead or charcoal. I personally went for like a blue graphite that I had, and then you go over the line art with a pen, and it will transfer the pencil to the paper, if that makes sense. It probably doesn't, but hopefully you guys get the idea. I think you can just look at like pencil transfer technique on YouTube and you'll understand what I mean. But next I went in with my multi-liner, and I have to say, this is where I was instilled with a little bit of a false sense of hope. I was genuinely enjoying using the liner on this paper. It went down so smooth and the color was so rich. I've had problems with this liner appearing on a lot of papers as more of like a reddish brown or even like a dark burgundy sort of color, when in actuality it's more of like a wineish purpley red, and that is the exact color that it came out on this paper. Like, when I tell y'all, I was so thrilled with how it looked. But as with most of my drawings, I wanted to give the liner some time to dry, and I actually did end up allotting for 2 entire days for it to dry, which was pointless because it literally did not matter. So let's get into what it was like to actually color this piece. So once the line work was dry, I started to erase the pencil, and I noticed that it just was having a very hard time coming off of the paper. Like, it was literally so hard to erase. I haven't sketched on this paper, so like I have no idea if this was a matter of technique, since I technically was firmly pressing the lead into the paper, even if it wasn't directly me using the pencil itself. And it wasn't like I was pressing very hard either, like it didn't, make any indentations or damage on the paper, but it certainly was not coming up when I tried to erase it. I'll have to see what it's like erasing an average sketch on this paper where I just directly use the pencil. But I literally had to go in with my electric eraser to buzz off the pencil lines, which I also noticed actually sort of changed the texture of the paper a bit. If I tilted the paper in the sunlight, I could see that some pieces were actually brighter and shinier where I'd erased, so I'm assuming it wore down the paper slightly. I didn't necessarily see any effect when it came in through the coloring though. All of the areas took the ink pretty much the same, so I'm not sure if any actual damage was done to the paper. Speaking of damage though, my line art, good lord, despite having literally 2 entire days, I'm talking 48 plus hours of drying time, it still managed to both bleed and smudge when I went over it with ink. It also didn't hold to the paper very well, because if I erased on top of the lines, it was pretty easy to just completely erase the line work. I had to go over a piece of the hair and the eye with my line art again because it faded so much when I used just the regular eraser to erase the pencil around that area. I'm used to like a little bit of fading, of course, as with anything when you apply friction to it, any sort of pen, even if it's not an erasable pen necessarily, if you apply enough, pressure and stuff to it, it will fade the slightest bit if it's a good pen. Yeah, this was practically like it was an erasable pen, which it is not because it's a micron. So yeah, it genuinely had like some really noticeable fading that needed some adjustment. And then, like I mentioned, when I started going in with the markers, the ink was just not having it. It was a total smudge fest. I think there were some areas where it was, relatively good, but anywhere I tried to do like sort of like blending, like I would say laying down base tones, it was pretty good. But if the minute I tried to start blending, adding more ink to the page and things like that, like when I do my normal blending technique, the ink was not having it. It literally was staining the tips of my markers purple. Like, it was crazy. I've never had such a problem with ink smudging unless I was literally using like cheap dollar store or ballpoint pens, or if I hadn't given the micron or whatever other line art pen I'd used a chance to dry properly, because microns, as nice as they are, you can't go straight in, like make your line art and then immediately go in with alcohol markers, because that ink is still wet, it's gonna smudge. But this was 48 plus, more than 48, rough estimate, I would say closer to 50 something hours of time for it to dry, and it did not. So that's not great. Also, while we're on the topic of drying properly, this drawing did not dry down correctly. The page is legitimately sticky, even a full 24 hours later. the page is sticky where the ink had been built up from trying to blend it in. It also was super patchy and left like a pretty weird texture. I would say it's similar to, for an example, when you put a little bit too much water down on watercolor paper, or even like copy paper, you know, paper that's not meant to hold water. It like was rubbing off the texture. Like it wasn't pilling a little bit, or like it wasn't like making that like, you know, texture on the paper, but like visually that's what it looked like. So not necessarily the most ideal appearance for an illustration. I'll show in more detail soon when I do the comparison so that I can properly sort of detail exactly what this hot mess looked like. That being said, I do have to give some credit where credit is due. These colors did not blend through the paper, or did not bleed through the paper at all whatsoever. There's not even a shadow of ink peeking through to the other side, which I can definitely appreciate. I certainly was trying to, you know, layer color on there, and there was none that bled through. I just really hoped that I'd have, you know, more room for actual layering and not necessarily pushing ink away, because that's really what I would describe would happen. E13, for example, that's a dark tan sort of color. I tend to use it for like shadows on like more like fair skin types, like if I'm doing like shadow around the eyelids or underneath the nose or the chin or the jaw or something like that, or like the ears, or if I feel like I'm just not getting enough shadow with my E11, for example, I will go in with E13 and kind of deepen those shadows a bit. And instead of deepening the shadow, it pushed the ink away, and it looked like it was almost exactly the same color as the E00. That's a big step away from it, but it looked practically the same. That's how much it dulls colors down and how much it just like pushes ink away rather than absorbing the actual color you're putting on the paper. I would really recommend, like, from my experience so far, only using flat colors for that, and then maybe doing something else for the shading. Yeah, like I said, I do intend to try and work with this sketchbook some more off camera, obviously, to kind of get a feel for how exactly I want to use it, and if there's any sort of like magic secret technique that I just have not figured out with this paper. But for now, I can't say I'm overly impressed with this sketchbook, and before y'all crucify me in the comments, like I mentioned before, I'm fully willing to admit that I could be doing something wrong. If you guys have any tips or know of any tricks when it comes to handling this sketchbook, I would genuinely love to hear it. I was so hyped to get my hands on this sketchbook. And once I've worked with it more, I definitely do have plans to do another review if my opinions on it have changed. If not, you probably won't be seeing a video. But if you do, things changed, obviously. But yeah, while I show you guys the comparison shots here, I do want to, of course, as always, say a big, huge thank you to my patrons, Elise Thompson, Duran, Mandy, Schleeps, Created by Twins, and Kruhi. You guys are the best. Thank you so much for continuing to support me every single month. As y'all might know, I've added some really cool new rewards to the Patreon, like digital downloads and Patreon exclusive playlists for as little as $1, and I've also added physical rewards like stickers and prints. Each month has a theme that all tiers of Patreon, or all tiers of patrons can vote on, and that vote also affects the theme of all the tier rewards, so it affects the digital download, the wallpaper, the stickers, the print, the playlist, things like that. Everything that is that month's theme, it affects all of the sort of rewards. So if you're interested in that, definitely go and check that out. July's theme is aliens, in honor of apparently World UFO Day, which I did not know was a thing, and which I was very delighted by. So if you guys would like the chance to vote on August theme or get your hands on some of July rewards, please consider checking out the Patreon. Thank you guys for watching. I love y'all so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.